Hello, everybody. Welcome to another PCA Sim Racing Classroom. This is week two, the second week of the first round of races at Road Atlanta. So we just came off of the first week, which was the club and sport classes of racing at Road Atlanta. We saw some really exciting racing with some record numbers in participation. Hopefully that keeps through the entire series. It's definitely was a bit of a surprise to me to see that many cars on track. But I think that's only a good thing. However, with that many cars comes all sorts of potential issues that can come up, especially with some shorter tracks like Road Atlanta. So first off, thanks everybody for joining for this classroom. We'll talk for about an hour, and then after this, if you're in Sport and Club, I believe Zone 1 is hosting an EDE track session still at Road Atlanta, so you can practice for your upcoming races on Wednesday and Thursday. But to get started off, I'm going to kind of open up the floor for kind of Q&A. Does anybody have any questions, anything they want to share with the group about anything? Frankly, if you raced last week, something that you saw, something that you would like to bring up that may help the group at large. Or any questions about Road Atlanta in general. Hey, I got problems with turn 7. What are some thoughts there? But yeah, I'll leave the first 20 minutes or so for today with that. So go ahead, sound off. And if not, I will call on people. So
I've got a question.
Yeah.
So a change this year is that we don't have incident race reports or whatever they're called, the IRRs. And I also heard a lot of chatter about people saying there was too much chatter on the comms with race control and all that stuff. So what's your point of view on the best way to handle in-race incidents, knowing that they have to be resolved during the race now instead of after the race?
Yeah, so it's a little bit different in the sense that one of the things we've got to be focused on. So normally I'm bringing up my whiteboard while I'm talking, so apologies. So in the past we had incident reports. So if you felt like you got slighted during the previous race, you could file a post-race incident report. The stewards will look at it after the race had done, and then they could throw out any kind of penalties or any kind of clarifications if it was warranted. What sounds like what they're doing this time ago is they're going to do all the stewarding live. And what that means is that, so in iRacing, if you are in race control, you can have a setting that basically shows you when an incident is given out by iRacing to another car, whether it be an off track, whether it be car contact, but they can keep a running log of the incidents and they can review them by going back in real time and taking a look at what transpired. So what I would say is that, if there was car contact, so if there's like something like a 4X or even a 2X, or even if there's a 0X that results in a 2X because somebody spun as a result, if there is car contact, the stewards are going to see it on their log, and they're supposed to be reviewing that. It may not be reviewed the lap that it happened. It may not be reviewed for 20 laps after it happened, but it is supposed to be reviewed at some point. And if actions were to be taken, they will be taken during the race with a black flag on the offending car. What does that mean for you as the driver? That means that you got to trust that the stewards are going to see it. And by trusting that they're going to see it, that means that you don't have to bring up to their attention, hey, take race control, take a look at car number 14 on my lap, yada, yada, on comms. Because it's a bit redundant to tell them that because they already have a record of all that. Similarly, if there was an incident and nothing has come down on it and you've got 10 minutes left with the race, it's not that they missed it. It's that they voted that there was going to be no impact from it. So what this all comes down to is effectively drive your race as you can. Right. So something happens, car contact happens, or you get spun by somebody else, get the ship righted, get back on track and keep driving. You got to have a really short memory as a race car driver. And so you got to forget what happened. You can't change the outcome. And if you sit there and you dwell on it for lap after lap, it's going to affect your driving, and it's also going to affect your lap times in general, and you may end up going off the track. If a penalty is warranted, it will come down via race control, and it may come down with a little bit of a delay. I remember in the pro race, for instance, in front of me saw the two cars in front of me get into it coming out of 10B, where one of them dove inside the other one and spun him, or at least pushed him sideways, and was able to get by them. And then I was able to get by the car that kind of got spun. And I said to myself at that point, I was like, ooh, that looks like a penalty. And so, but I wasn't fast enough to get back by that car. I could hang on to his bumper, but I didn't think I could really challenge him until maybe very late in the race if he overdrove his tires. Sure enough, about 20 minutes later, a whole slew of penalties came down through race control all at the same time, including the car that was in front of me. He had to pit in order to take the black flag and clear the penalty, which let me inherit the place. So, you can use reason to say, okay, that's going to probably end up being a penalty. If you want to make a strategic decision on whether you want to challenge someone. But do trust that, it may not come on the next lap, may not come on the 10th lap after this, but at some point, if a penalty is warranted, it will come down. It's a very long-winded way of saying that. Does that answer your question, Chad?
Yeah, the reason I asked is I got involved in an incident after other incidents in front of me. And so I guess I was a little unsure of when an incident begins and ends, because the incident in front of me, like the one you just described, was crystal clear. A whole bunch of cars tried to avoid it. And in the avoidance, other incidents happened that eventually I got collected in. So, it was big enough that I assumed race control saw it, but looked like only one driver of like the 8 drivers that were involved in contact got a penalty, but I had nothing to do with that incident. I avoided it. I got caught up in another incident and nothing ever happened after that. So I just wondered if there was I didn't say anything on comms because I assumed that race control saw it. I thought you could file an IRR to get clarity on whether it was an incident or not. And then the answer was no. So, short-term memory, yeah, but I didn't know, like, at what point in time is it the driver's responsibility to speak up?
Yeah, I mean, again, I would say that at the end of the day, iRacing can be, and our league in general, can be operated as though you don't have a mic and you're not listening to comms, except for the race, a little debrief at the beginning at the, before we get started, and when DJ comes on and gives the words of wisdom before the green flag takes place, right? But after that point, if you want to mute your comms and not use comms, you're more than welcome to, and it shouldn't affect your race negatively at all. So, you don't have to reach out to race control. They're aware of it. Like I said, even if it's a 0x, it comes up as car contact. And they're supposed to be, because they got rid of IR, they're supposed to be looking at all incidents like that. So in your incident, for instance, I didn't see it. I don't know exactly what the circumstances was, but if it was a chain reaction because one car hit another car, that resulted in a bunch of cars moving and avoiding action and going through grass, and then other cars made contact with each other as a result of that, then race control, I can confidently say, looked at the whole incident and then gave the penalties where they deemed them to be necessary. So again, it's one of those things that, and it happens to me sometimes too, I may get tapped, I may feel like somebody dove bombed me and I opened my hands and it resulted in me losing a place, and I could think that that's got to be a penalty, but I'm biased in that situation, right? And me coming on the comms and asking for a review of that is redundant because it's already being reviewed.
Yeah, that's good. I think that's the takeaway: is assume that race control sees everything and you don't have to say anything on comms
until after the race. I mean, you can always message DJ or anybody in race control. I think they've got even more people in race control now. It's not just DJ and Doug. But I think Rusty's in there, for example. After the race, you can always message any of the stewards and say, hey, can you give me some clarity on why something wasn't called a penalty? And unless they come to you and say, well, we never saw it, okay, well, then that throws my whole theory out of the water, right? But I doubt that's going to happen. They can give you a reason after the race why it wasn't called a penalty. So until something like that happens, assume that everything's being reviewed in real time and things will be dealt out equitably as they come up. Good question, though. Any other questions? Anything like that? I saw a lot of chatter regarding open qualifying and closed qualifying. I'll sum it up really quickly. It's open qualifying, so you better learn to love it for this series. And if you can't get beyond that, then you're going to be behind the eight ball every single time you go into qualifying. If you go into qualifying with the idea of, oh man, it's open qualifying, it's not fair, everybody's going to block me, I'm never going to be able to get a good lap in, guess what? You're never going to get a good lap in because your mentality going into it is already negative. For this, whether you like it or you don't like it, when you go to open qualify in a race or you go to perform in any race, that format of racing better be your most favorite thing in the world for that hour and a half that you're racing, if it's for a competition. So it's a little bit of sports psychology, right? For instance, most sports probably not my most favorite track in the world, but for next week, it's going to be my favorite track, and I'm going to love that place. And that's the mentality you've got to have going into it. It's the same thing with the qualifying and the format of the race. Hey, you may hate open qualifying. You think it's unfair. You think people are gaming the system and drafting off each other. But you know what? When that green flag flies for open qualifying and that server opens, that better be your favorite format in the world. And you better approach it like, hey, you know what? I can go faster if I can get a draft on the proper place, or I'm going to find a hole and I'm going to go as fast as I can. And I'm going to show everybody else that I love this format. And then once you're done with it, then you can go back to saying, I hate this format again, until you got to do it again. But it's here to stay. It's not going anywhere. We're trying something new. I don't make the rules. So, I'm not even on the steering committee or anything like that. So I'm just a passenger in this as much as everybody else. But yeah, the people that are going to do well are the people that adapt and learn to love it. Are there any questions about open qualifying? And it doesn't have to be the mechanics behind it. It can also be, hey, what are some strategies to go, fast in open qualifying? Those are perfectly legitimate questions as well. No, nothing? Okay. And then you guys all love it.
Chris?
Yes.
Yeah, Chris, Johan's talking, but you must still have him on mute, or you've muted
Oh,
him.
do I? Here, let me flip it. Sorry about that. Johan, go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I got you.
Yeah, last week was my first open qualifying. I found it challenging, to say the least, with 50 cars on the track.
Yeah.
But I did have a couple of questions. One is, how do you recognize when a car coming up behind you is doing a hot lap? And someone that's just warming up? Yeah,
so if you come out of pit lane, right, and any cars that are coming up behind you, you will actually get a blue and yellow flag in iRacing, the passing flag. That shows that, somebody is on a lap behind you. You should probably, or you shouldn't block them, or you shouldn't impede them. Also in general, if you're on your out lap, right, you're probably not going 10 tenths, or you probably shouldn't be going 10 tenths on your way out. And therefore anybody that catches you on your out lap, you should just go ahead and yield to them. Just move over to the side, wait till it's straight away, give a little bit of a lift. You don't even have to come completely out of the throttle, but just give them a little bit of a lift, let them go by, and then proceed on your way. And then once you cross start finish line, now you're on your hot lap, and you are the one trying to set a qualifying time at that point. If you make a mistake in a lap, like let's say you spin, you may get a black flag and you may have to reset your car depending on the scrutiny that's going on. But let's say you don't get a black flag. Well, that lap shot, right? If you got a 1X or you had picked up any incidents during your lap, that doesn't qualify for your qualifying lap. So, you are no longer on your hot lap at that point. And so if you dropped a tire in the dirt and you picked up a 1X, you may still be 3 tenths up on your best time ever, but it's still not going to count because you have an incident during that lap. It's an unclean lap. So anybody coming up behind you, assume they're on a banger and assume they're on their hot lap. And as a result, yield to them until you cross start finish line again. And then now you're on a hot lap, and you should be expecting, if you come up on other cars that are not on a hot lap, to have them yield to you. So that's kind of the mentality of it. And then in general, you got to find a place where you can, even with 50 cars at Road Atlanta, it's a ton of cars on a relatively small track, you can find space. Everybody's in class, in their class, so they're within a similar group of people that run similar pace. So it's not like you're in multi-class where there's gonna be 10 seconds difference between cars. At most, the variance is going to be maybe a second and a half, maybe 2 seconds from pole down to last place. at a place like Road Atlanta or Mosport. All the cars are kind of doing their own thing, and they're all kind of just circulating at the same time. So unless you somehow start a fast lap right on the bumper of another car, odds are you can find a couple of seconds between you and the car in front to be able to, even if you put down the hottest lap, you're still not going to catch the guy in front of you. And you can create those gaps by looking at your relative, saying, okay, I got 5 seconds to the guy behind me. I'm coming up to the couple last corners. I'm about to start on my hot lap. The guy in front of me is only 1 second up. You know what? I'm going to do a little bit of lift. I'm going to let the guy behind me catch me, so at least I stay at least a couple seconds ahead of him. But I'm going to let the guy in front of me go from 1 second to maybe 3 seconds. And I know I'm not going to bridge a 3-second gap in this one short lap. That allows me to have a perfectly clean lap all the way around. Just that little tiny gap. I think in the pro class, what was it? From pole to 42nd place were covered within 1 second. And there's going to be more variance the further down in the class as you go, as the skill gap widens a little bit. But I mean, yeah, if 42 cars are going within a second of each other, you can have 150 cars out there. You could still find a place to run a good lap, so long as you're thinking in a macro sense and thinking about where all these cars are going to be and how to create a little bit of space for you to run your lap.
Second question I had was, if you want to have a hot car, you're trying to pass them on the straight, you stay offline. How do you stay offline when you're going around the turn? Or do you just wait before you enter the turn to let everyone pass and then go into the turn?
Yeah, so if you get caught, like let's say you're on your out lap and you've got cars coming up on you and you're at Road Atlanta, let's say, and you're coming into 10A and 10B, how do you let people by in 10A and 10B? Well, it's easier to let people by on a straightaway because you just have to lift and then they can go around you. In a turn, it's much more difficult. But if you are trying to let somebody by in a turn, you got to be completely offline in the weeds, not impeding them. So let's say if you were going into turn 10A, 10A is the hard braking zone to the first part of the chicane, and to 10B at the end of the track. If you're trying to let somebody take the apex and take the corner and you're just going to let them go at the apex, you need to be on the right side of the track, kind of just putting around the outside. You're saying to the other car and you're showing them, I have no intention to do anything here. Go ahead. It's your corner. It's not mine. If you get in a really terrible situation where you've got a train of cars on you and you don't even want to deal with it, you can always just pull off into the grass and just reset your car and try to find a better spot. That's always an option that we have here too. You have unlimited resets in the qualifying run. There really shouldn't be too much of an excuse to slow somebody down unless you made a terrible mistake and then you find yourself in a really awkward spot. And that happens, and that's one of the things about open qualifying. But at the same time, we got 30 minutes. If you can't set a lap in 30 minutes, then you probably weren't going to set one anyway, frankly. So,
can I add something there, Chris?
Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
Sure, Johan. I know exactly what you mean. I've been coming out of the pits at Road Atlanta, coming up to 2, and between 3 and 5, there isn't really anywhere where you want somebody to try to pass you, and there's nowhere that you can really hide to get them to get past you. I usually floor it, do my damnedest to get around to 5, and then stay completely offline and slow up. And if I can get those guys by me on that straight and I haven't impeded them until then, great. Otherwise, I just have to stick to my line on those S's as quick as I can. I'm going to really watch my relatives, but Chris is right. You can find 2 seconds in front of you, 2.5 seconds behind you, and that can set you a good lap more than once.
Yeah.
The other one I had a challenge with is 6 and 7, trying to stay offline going through there.
I would argue in 6 and 7 at Road Atlanta, you go as fast as you can. And if somebody catches you between 6 and 7, frankly, their lap is done anyway. Because if they try to pass you into 7, their lap is not going to be their fast lap. The fastest way through between 6 and 7 is to be in a train, no matter how slow the car in front is, to go through there. So, like Jim just said, going through the S's, go as fast as you can. They can't pass you safely anyway. It is what it is. 6 and 7, it's the exact same thing. There's just certain parts in the track where it's just kind of there's only one line through there. And so the best thing you can do for everybody in that case is to go as fast as you can to get to a spot where you can let people buy safely. And it's going to be a lot more of that at Most Sport too. I mean, shoot. The only really good place to pass at Most Sport is the big long straight. There's a little miniature straight between turn 1, 2, 3, between 3 and 4 that you can lift, but you'd have to do a full on lift, get offline and let the car by. You have to actively want them to get by to let them get by there. Doing a little tiny lift or a half lift there is not good enough at Most Sport. And then you got the big long straightaway, and that's a decent place. That's like the straightaway at Road Atlanta as well. But there's a lot of similarities between Most Sport and Road Atlanta in terms of how they have to be driven. That's a very good question.
I have a related question to that, Chris.
Yeah.
And Jim, would you say it's not, if you're on your outlap, it's not good track etiquette to maybe even pull off on the grass? Because there's a spot at the top of the S's. There's a spot on the right and the left between 6 and 7, and even at the bottom of before you get to 10A. There were a couple times when I was on my outlap and I saw a train of hot cars come in, and I just pulled off onto the grass. Is that not, you're not supposed to do that?
I don't know if there's something against it, Jim, so slap me if I'm wrong here, but if you pull off into the grass and you park the car in order to take a tow, you're off the racing circuit. No one else should not impede anyone, because no one should be in the grass, because even if they were in the grass, that would nullify the lap anyway. So if you, like I said, you see a train coming up behind you, and you just don't want to deal with it, you're on your outlap and you're like, I'm just going to pull off into the grass in a safe, controlled manner. Yeah, I'd totally be fine with that. Pull off into the grass, reset your car, and try to find a better spot. The thing we don't want to see, though, we don't want you to see you slow down online, and then once you're at 50 miles an hour, then pull it over into the grass, right? Because now you're going 50 miles an hour online on track with cars bearing down on you, and that can cause an incident, right? But if you see it coming, you can safely get off the track surface without impeding one in that process, then yeah, go ahead, and then you can take a tow like that. That's totally fine.
Yeah, I mean, where I did it most often was coming out of the pits. If I got around turn 3 before the cars behind me started coming up, there's a spot, there's a lot of room to the right, and there's even a whole car width on the grass that you can literally, you don't have to stop. You can just pull way over to the right next to the tire wall, let everybody through, and keep going on your outlap.
Yeah, exactly. And every track's a little different, so it's one of those, you gotta think ahead, and think about, if you were the car that is coming up on the hot lap and they came up on you, how would you want the slow car to behave? Right, and then try to emulate that. So, all very good.
It's really fairly simple in mind when you start out and start your qualifying. I mean, it's just like an open track practice. If there's someone coming up on you that has pace on you, instead of staying online and blocking them, you want to get out of their way. To pull over a little bit, slack a little bit, jump back and be in behind them, and keep running laps. Eventually you're going to find yourself with enough time in front, enough time in back to run your stuff. It gets confusing if you're thinking, okay, I'm going to go reset in the pits, let me try to pull over into the grass and park it here. There's no reason you can't drive back into the pits or continue on your line. Just fall in between cars here and there, just like you would during a practice.
Yep. Cool, good stuff. Any other questions on qualifying? All right, hearing none. All right, any other questions about, let's do Road Atlanta first. So any other questions about Road Atlanta, the track, or the upcoming race for the challenge in sport, guys? If you haven't already, or you have any questions about it, my track walk from last week, and if you haven't seen it, should be up in the EDE channel up above. So feel free to click that and then watch it. I go through a pretty detailed turn by turn what I'm looking at and what I'm thinking when I drive Road Atlanta. So maybe there's some nuggets of information there. Other than that, but if you have any questions before your race as well, you can feel free to message me here on Discord, or message Jim, or frankly anybody that has a mod tag on their name. That would be definitely willing to help you. Okay, so if there's no questions about Road Atlanta, are there any questions about the car, the GT3R, the setup, things to think about, how to drive it?
I did have a question.
Sure, Jim.
Not necessarily my question, but I know we were riding around in some other car. I think it was the GT4, and people were complaining about the setup. You know, granted, it's not a custom setup; it's just a standard setup. But what is your advice if you are struggling with the baseline that we've decided for a particular track? If you can't get it to turn in without doing adjustments to the car, what can you adjust as a driver to get that turn in to work better for you?
Okay, so you're struggling with understeer? Is
that oversteer? But typically it's understeer that people are struggling with. I just wanted your advice on how to overcome that as a driver instead of going to get a wrench.
Yeah. So, yeah, exactly. So all setup does is I'm grabbed a car so we can see. All setup does is it kind of helps the car have a certain tendency when driving the car. So you can have a setup that tends to be it tends to rotate and be more oversteer when it starts to lose grip. You can have a setup that's really safe and it tends to understeer at the limit. And you can have everything in between, how the car handles and transient maneuvers. There's a lot you can do with these GT3s in setup. However, even if you have an understeery setup, that doesn't mean that it's just an understeery mess. The way you're going to be able to drive around it is you have to change your driving style. So here we go. Imagine this is a beautiful GT3R, not a Shelby GT500, it looks like. And so if the car is understeery, which the baseline setups tend to do because it tends to be safer and more predictable, that means the front end of the car is losing grip before the rear of the car. So you're going through a corner, and when you say, you can look at it this way. So if you're going through a corner that is going this way, when the car starts to lose grip, the front end is going to lose grip first, which is going to result in the front pushing out and you understeering. By contrast, an oversteer situation would be the rear of the car going around that same corner would lose grip first. And when that happens, the rear would lose its grip, it would oversteer, and you would result in a car that tends to rotate. Well, what can we do to affect our grip at certain areas of the car? Well, we've got our tires on all four corners. We have a gas pedal and we have a brake pedal, which means we can influence the weight transfer of the car. And weight transfer of the car affects how much grip different sides of the car have. So under braking, when we brake, the nose of the car goes down. The weight transfers from the middle of the car in a neutral state to the front of the car, which means that these front tires are getting pushed into the ground. The contact patch is growing and we have more grip up front. Conversely, if we are accelerating, we're shifting the weight to the rear of the car. We're taking the weight off the front. We're putting weight over the rear tires. We're pushing the rear tires into the ground, which means the rear has more grip under acceleration. So if we're going through a corner and we're experiencing understeer where the front of the car is pushing through the corner, what can we do? Well, we can trail brake into the corner more, which means that we're going to add more weight to the front tires, which means we're going to give them more grip. It also means that the rear tires are going to have less grip, which means the car is going to tend to want to rotate more under braking when you go into a corner, which means that on initial turn-in, if we stay on the brakes a little bit more or we delay getting on the throttle, we theoretically will have more oversteer than we normally would. Now, the setup may still say you're going to have understeer, but what I'm talking about is it's all relative. You'll have less understeer than if you wouldn't perform it that way. Let's say, and I know a lot of people I've seen have been having problems in turn 2 at Most Sport, which is a big sweeping downhill left-hander. If you're constantly or consistently spinning the car through that corner, so again, here's the car from the up, from the top down, corner goes this way. As you are turning into this corner, the rear end is trying to swap or swap ends with you and you are spinning the car going through that, well, it's because you've got no grip in the rear. So how do you get grip in the rear? Well, you get on throttle a little earlier. If you get on throttle a little earlier, it settles the rear, it pushes the rear tires into the ground, gives you more grip in the rear, which means it's going to reduce the amount of oversteer you're going to experience in any given corner, including turn 2. So taking turn 2 at most sport, let's say, and let's say it's turn 1 at Road Atlanta too. They're very similar corners, just one's going up and one's going down. If you're getting oversteer going through any of those turns, what you need to do is you need to take the first part of the corner a little bit slower. So you need to brake a little earlier. When you turn in, you need to turn in such a way where you're not trail braking into the corner as much, because if you're trail braking into the corner, you got less grip on the rear tires. The rear is going to want to rotate around. So what you're going to end up doing is you're going to brake in a straight line, and then right as you turn in, you're going to get off the brakes and maybe even add a little maintenance throttle, which will settle the rear, which when you go through the corner, like at most sport turn 2, if you're on throttle, the rear has more grip and it's going to push you through the corner as opposed to spin you around the corner. If you go into turn 2 at most sport and you brake too late, let's say, or you don't brake at all and you just kind of chunk it in there and then you pop off the throttle when you do that, you're basically asking the car to grip up and then you're taking the grip away from the rear tires at the same time, which is going to induce a spin. So there's different things you can do by driving the car to affect how that car handles in certain situations. Does that make sense? I could also
awesome. Thank you.
I could also probably draw it too, but that's just, I mean, at the end of the day, driving dynamics, all performance driving is weight transfer and contact patch management. That's all it is. The person who can manage their contact patches, these 4 little spots on is the only things that are keeping you in contact with the road. Whoever can manage those contact patches the best for the different scenarios that they're coming across when they drive around a track is probably going to have an advantage over everybody else. So using the weight transfer of the car to grow and shrink those contact patches in a way that lets the car do what you want it to do. If you can get that down, I mean, that's a huge fundamental of driving a race car or driving any car quickly around a track. If you can get that kind of understanding of what you're doing when you're driving or what the car is trying to do when you're driving, you can do a lot of things. You can make the car go faster than it normally would. You can also self-teach yourself. So you go through turn 2, you spun it, you think to yourself, why did the car spin? Well, if it's spun, I have no grip in the rear. Well, why did it have no grip in the rear? Am I getting off the throttle too early mid-corner, taking the grip from the rear tires? Maybe I'll think about that. Maybe I'll try to get on throttle sooner to settle the rear. You see what you can do. You can start coaching yourself on how to be a better driver without even looking at data. That's just trying to fix the mechanics of the car. And then once you start really getting the feeling of that, once you start getting really into the minutia of how the car behaves and you're trying to pick off hundredths and tenths through a corner, then you got to look at data to glean those extra little bits of time around a lap. Good? Makes sense?
Hey, thanks for that explanation, Chris. That was good. Pit stop strategies. You got any?
Okay.
Got any mess?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Pit stops. So we have pit stops. So, and what pit stops can do with the strategy is in general. So I'm going to try to draw it since I've got the little board in front of me. Okay. So here is your race. So let's just assume we're doing 1 hour. I know Challenge is doing 40 minutes, but Challenge still has a pit stop, right, Jim?
Yes.
Okay, so it doesn't matter. But this is your race length, this line, right? So we'll say it's 1 hour. And let's say the car, if I recall correctly, at Road Atlanta can do 40 minutes on a tank. And again, if you're in Challenge, it's going to be a little different. But again, it's not the full 1 hour. So let's say on a full tank, we can do 40 minutes. So basically what that means is that at the 20-minute mark and the 40-minute mark, we have a pit window. So this is what we would call the pit window. So we can pit anywhere in that pit window, and still, we can pit anywhere in this pit window and make it to the end of the race at the end of when it comes down to it. If we pit before the 20-minute mark, we can't make it to the end because we can only put 40 minutes of fuel in the car, and an hour minus 20, that is 40. So if we pit on minute 18, that means we're going to be 2 minutes short of fuel, everything else considering. Now you can change how you drive and try to save fuel, but we're just trying to view it in a vacuum right here. Okay. So you can pit anywhere in this pit window. So what are the advantages of pitting on lap 20 right at the immediate part of the pit window? You know, why do a lot of people, whenever you watch these guys and you see the pro race, all the pros are going to like the 40-minute mark before they pit, the last possible second. Why is it not anybody pitting here? Well, the reason is because of traffic. So let's say you are in, I'm going to scroll up a little bit and scroll down. Let's say you are in, I don't know, 10th place. So we're going to say you're in P10 currently right now, which means you've got P9, 8, 7, 6, 5, etc. in front of you, and you've got P11, 12, etc. behind you. So this is your car right here. And let's say you're sitting in P10 all hunky-dory. You got a 1 second gap to P9 in front of you and a 1 second gap to P11 behind you. But everybody is pretty much regular at 1 second intervals, just for the ease of things. So let's just say this is, 1 second. Same thing back here. That's 1 second. If you pit early, let's say you pit right on the 20-minute mark, right when the pit window opens, you are removing yourself from P10, and you are going to put yourself out, probably I'd say 40 seconds behind of wherever you currently are. So if you take yourself out of here, you pit early, you are going to come out of pit lane probably in if everybody's 1 second, and let's say it's a 30-second pit stop, and you're in P10, you're going to come out in P40, are behind everyone else. So you're going to have 39, 38, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and 1 second given to everybody. But you've done your pit stop, and everybody else is also going to have to pit. So if everybody else pits the exact same way at the whatever time within that window, theoretically, if everything is consistent and nobody has different pace, you will come back out at P10 once the pit cycles are done. The problem is not all cars are driving the same pace. Some cars can go faster, some cars can't go faster. So at Road Atlanta, for instance, let's talk about the slow car keeping up. So let's say you're rolling around in P10. You've got a big gap to P9. Now all of a sudden, instead of 1 second, it's 10 seconds. And growing as the race goes along. And the gap to P11 behind you is like 0.5 seconds. But he's not making any moves. You tend to leave him in the corners, but when you get to that big long straight, he's drafting on you and he bridges the gap back down. So what's happening is you don't have a draft off the guy in front of you. In fact, the gap is growing, but the guy behind you is drafting off of you on every single lap, and that's the only way that he's keeping up with you. One thing you might want to consider is pitting really early, which means that it will take you out of P10 and put you at the back of the field. But hopefully, if it gives you free air, meaning there's nobody around you and you can drive your pace, once P11 does his pit stop and then comes out behind you later on in the pit window, the gap will have grown to a period of time where it is now, let's say, 4 seconds instead of half a second. He won't have your draft, and at that point, you'll be able to drive away from him because the draft was the only thing keeping him in play. So you're basically removing his advantage. You're taking the draft away from your opponent that's behind you and saying, okay, you got to run that pace on your own. I'm going to go keep running the pace that I'm running just somewhere else during the pit window. And then when you come out of your pit window, you're going to be at some point behind me. right? So that is one way you can use a pit stop, pit early, take away the advantage that somebody else may be having by drafting on you and keeping up with you because of that. Conversely, the other thing you may consider is, let's say it's reversed. So instead of a 10-second penalty to P9 in front of you, you're within 1 second. So let's just say 1 second. A 1 second gap to P9 in front of you, but you have his draft. You're driving along with him. You're biding your time in the pit window. It doesn't make sense for you to pit early at that point, because if you do that, now you are no longer in his draft. So you are doing what you had done in the previous scenario to P11. You are taking yourself out of P9's draft, and now you're going to have to run whatever pace you were running with no draft, which means it could be more difficult to do if you didn't have that pace. So by pitting early behind P9, you could be in a bad spot. Conversely, let's say you're sitting right behind P9. You're constantly right on his bumper. He's definitely slowing you down, but it's Road Atlanta. You can't get by him in a safe way. If you pit early and it puts you in clean air where you can run faster laps because you're not following somebody, because they're not holding you up, then when P9 pits in their pit window later on in the race, just like the very first scenario we talked about with P11, he will come out behind you because you have been running faster laps during that pit window after you have already pitted. The other thing to consider on a pit is that you need to take, and this is the hard part because we don't all have spotters. Some people do, and it's a big advantage. But you got to consider where you're going to come out of pit lane into the field behind you if you pit early. So if you pit as late as possible, that guarantees that you're not going to come out in 40th place behind P39, who's running half a second slower than you were before you pitted, and slower traffic in general. If you go all the way to the end of your fuel tank on the 40-minute mark and you pit, then everybody else has to have pitted at that point as well, which takes away that possibility of you pitting and then coming out in the middle of the pack and having to be slow because now you have traffic to deal with. So that's why you tend to see the guys that are at the front of the race, rather than risk pitting and then coming out in P20 or something, they'll just run till the tank is dry because they know no one else can go any further. So when they come out of pit lane, they're going to remain in the position that they're in. There's not going to be this jostling. So that's kind of the pit strategy you kind of got to think about is, I'd say is, what's the delta to the car in front of me? Am I being slowed down by that car? And can I go faster if I were to be in clean air? If the answer is yes, then you may want to consider pitting early so long as it doesn't put you in traffic with the crowd back behind you. If it's going to put you in traffic with the crowd behind you, it may be best just to sit behind where you're at and do what you can to conserve fuel. So when you do pit, instead of being a 30-second pit stop, maybe it's a 28-second pit stop. So when you pit right behind P9 at the exact same time, you saved fuel, you saved an extra lap of fuel. Your pit stop's shorter because there's less fuel that has to go into the car. You come out in front of them and you pass them in the pit lane because you've been saving for the past 40 minutes. Those are the kind of strategies that a pit stop can employ. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. That's a lot to think about, but thank you.
Yeah. Hey, Chris, related, sort of the inverse of that. So imagine you have an incident early in the race before the pit window opens. Two scenarios. One, you have a meatball before the pit window opens. Do you take fuel? And two, you've got damage but not a meatball. Do you pit as early as possible, or what should be your criteria to determine if you're going too slow relative to race pace and when you should pit?
So if you got a meatball is not an advisory flag. A meatball is a command flag. So you have 3 laps to serve that meatball. The car could feel absolutely perfect, and you could be absolutely on pace with how you were driving before. But if you've got a meatball, you got to come in to get the repair taken. In general, if you're, and this is, I'm not considering black flag scenarios where you have a penalty, so please put those aside. In general, if you come down pit lane and you haven't taken a pit stop yet, so you're going to have to fill with fuel at some point, fill with fuel. You're in pit lane already. You're already taking the hit from time that takes you to go from cone to cone. You might as well, when you stop in the box to take that quick repair, go ahead and top off with fuel, because if you don't, you're going to have to come back around anyway. So go ahead and fill the car with fuel. You're already there. So that's kind of in general, it's kind of endurance racing 101. You're in the pit box, unless it's some weird circumstance, fill the thing with fuel, and repair the damage that you've incurred. If you have a meatball and you're required. Now, let's say you have damage, your car is not going as fast, but you don't have a meatball flag. Do you come in or do you come out? Well, if you got a spotter that can do the math, that helps. But essentially, you know, like I rode Atlanta, I would say in usual tracks, just coming down pit lane is like a 20-second time penalty that you're going to incur. And that's like 21 seconds, come down pit lane, stop in your box, take that quick repair, and then off without taking any fuel or tires. It's going to be 20 seconds. If you're running within half a second of what you were running before, or even if you're running within a second, that means you would have to run that car damaged for 20 laps before the delta between pitting and then coming back out and running those fast laps before it would pay off. So the answer to your question is it depends on how much of the race has happened. If you're on lap 1, you've suffered damage and it's an hour-long race, it pays off to come get the car fixed, get back out there. If the gap between your optimal lap, the lap time you can run without damage, and the lap time you are now running because you are damaged, is in a way that you can make that time up by having a fresh car, if you have the time to do that. If you're in the last 10 minutes of a race, let's say, and you pick up that damage, no meatball, but you can keep running, you'll never get that time back that you go down pit lane. That 20 seconds you're going to lose. So even though, yeah, it sucks and you're going to end up losing 2 seconds a lap, let's say, you're still not, it's going to have to be 10 laps before you would get that back, if that makes sense. So that's the kind of math you got to think in your head real quick. So really early in the race, if you've got damage, okay, it may make sense to pit and get that fixed and take that fast repair, top it off with fuel and get back out there, especially if you haven't pitted yet for fuel. If it's late in the race and you're done with your pit stop, and you still have damage and you're still slow, it usually benefits you just to go ahead and stay out and tough it out. But that's a good question.
So just to be clear, you would top it off even if you know topping it off won't get you to the end of the race? You still have to make a second pit stop?
Yeah, because it's going to shorten that last. You're going to have to come in for 2 pit stops anyway, right? I would much rather go ahead and take. I'm going to be in pit lane. I much rather. I know I've got to take fuel. Go ahead and top me off, and we'll keep going. Yes, I may have to come back down and get a splash to get me to the end, but it's only going to be a splash. If you come down pit lane, don't top off, and then take off again. When you come back down pit lane again to get to get fuel, you're going to have to do a full fuel load anyway. So it's going to end up being kind of a net nothing. If you really do need to do 2 pit stops, but you never know. Sometimes you may be able to save fuel. Who knows? Maybe there's a yellow flag that gets thrown. Not saying that there would be, but it could happen. I just much rather know that I'm in pit lane. If I'm in pit lane, I might as well make it worth it and go ahead and take the fuel that I need, or as much as I can. That's why you also see, if you ever watch like IMSA on TV, even if a car has a ton of damage or whatever, or look at Formula 1 too. Well, not Formula 1. They don't fill with fuel, do they? But yeah, you look at any IMSA race or anything, when the car comes into pit lane, even if it's got the rear clip just hanging off of it and needs to go into the garage, what do? They stick the fuel nozzle in, they fill that thing with full fuel. They don't touch the car because you can't do anything while the car is filling up. And then they take the fuel nozzle out and then they do whatever repairs they need to do every single time in endurance racing. But it's a good question. Any other questions? That's good stuff. Strategy is really good, and I don't think we talk about it enough because, well, for whatever reason, we're too busy driving the car, right? But strategy, especially with a pit stop, that can win or lose you a race, or put you somewhere that you may end up sneaking up higher than you think that you should be because of a good strategy call or something like that. So keep that in mind.
Chris, there was something you said a couple of years ago, that made a lot of sense to me, and I continue working on it. I'm not as good as a lot of you guys doing it, but it is a skill that you have to develop as well. Make sure during your practice, during your qualify, whatever it is, that you practice going into your pit at whatever speed you can go, because you can lose 3 seconds getting on the brake and making sure your car is down to 45 or whatever, or you can do what those other guys do, and they fly that thing in there. They know a brake marker going in where they have to pound on it, hit their limiter, and they just cross the line as it turns red to green, and you're good to go. It's part of the racing surface.
Yeah, pit entry and pit exit is just another corner on the track. It's just 2 corners that you only take once in our races. So, you know, I mean, everybody has done the pit entry, I'm sure, at Road Atlanta, and it's the craziest little pit entry, right? I mean, it's a chicane on its own. If you haven't practiced that to take it at speed, and you kind of, when you pit in, you kind of just trundle down there, you're giving up 3-4 seconds on the field for someone that has practiced it and treated it like a corner and gotten that thing down. How many times when you're racing would you think to yourself, man, I wish, you know, if I had another 4 seconds that I could somehow find during this race, that would put me another 3 spots ahead of where I currently am. And if you haven't practiced pit lane speeds, and as Jim just said, you can definitely lose 4 seconds easily doing your pit stop, then there it is. And it's relatively easy to do. So make sure you practice pit out every single time you practice, because every time you start from the pit lane, right? So you know where the cone is. You got to practice hitting that pit limiter right when the cone goes out. But what a lot of us, and myself included, I'm guilty of it on some races. You also got to practice that pit in. You know, often when we practice, we drive, and we're like, oh, okay, I've done my 30 minutes of practice. I'm done. I pull off to the side of the road, and then I just tow and then quit the sim. Now, take it to pit lane. If there's going to be a pit stop, practice going into pit lane. And every time you go into pit lane, pretend it's a race scenario. And drive it and see how quick you can get down it without, you know, tripping the speed limit penalty. And that's the other thing, is also be careful. Don't speed in pit lane, because that'll ruin your race real quick too.
Yeah, just set a brake marker in the pit entrance, and you know, move that up if you can. Keep trying it. It is definitely a corner of the race. You can put your brake marker as far as you want. There is, you know, there's lots to look at. Just find where you're comfortable with and stick to that.
Yeah. And the other thing to consider too is if you are in a train of cars, like the scenario that I've got in front of us is, right? Let's say you're P10 and you're less than 1 second behind P9, and you guys are both going to go all the way to the 40-minute mark before you pit, the last possible second. You potentially could be coming into pit lane right on the other guy's bumper. And if he hasn't practiced pit lane, you could run right into the back of him, right? He may brake way early and just, you know, drive like a grandpa going into pit lane. You got to be ready for that. So sometimes if I'm right on somebody's bumper on track, I don't want to pit when he pits. So I might pit a lap early to avoid that scenario where I can only go as fast as the car in front of me going into pit lane, because it's only 1 car wide. So sometimes I pit a lap early, or if he pits a lap early, I'll go to the full distance. I'll do whatever he doesn't do in those kind of scenarios to avoid having to go into pit lane right behind somebody. Do we run Montreal this season? Do you know, Jim, or anybody?
I don't think so.
Okay, good. Then we don't have to worry about it. Montreal is the only track that if you're going down pit lane in the pit entry, you are going faster than the cars on track going through the Wall of Champions corner. That is a weird and frankly unsafe pit entry, because if you ever driven Montreal, pit lane is way past the braking point for the final chicane. So if you're going into pit lane, you can just blow through the brake zone for the Wall of Champions, because the brake zone is much, much later. And if somebody is not pitting and you're right behind them and you just stay on it, you're just going to go right through the rear of him if he's online, because the pit entry is also right on line. It's really bizarre. I hate it. Anyway, I digress. All right, about 5 minutes left. Any other questions? This has been good. I like the pit question. That's a really good one. Are you nervous? Those of you in challenge and in sport, are you nervous about this race? Do you have butterflies going? If you don't, you're inhuman. So it's good to have butterflies. I get butterflies.
Every race.
Every, I kid you not, every race I get butterflies. The other thing I'll leave you guys with is the mentality aspect. I touched on it at the very beginning, and I don't think it's talked about enough. But in general, you know, what we're doing is a high stress, very, very fine motor skill sport. Yeah, we're in a sim and it's not, you know, real racing, but it is. I mean, we're still asking, we're asking for millimeter precision at triple digit speeds. And the only way you're going to be able to perform at that level is to have your mind in a proper place. If you doubt yourself going into races, odds are you're probably not going to have a good race. You're defeating yourself before you even get behind the wheel. So it benefits you to, and you may not be the kind of person that is, you know, a traditionally super confident person. Let's say I'm definitely not one of those people, but you've got to somehow be able to switch in your brain to basically say, I am hot shit when you're going into a racetrack and everybody has to beat me. I'm the one to beat. That kind of mentality will enable you to have that confidence to drive the car the way it has to be driven in order to perform well. If you go into the race saying, well, I'm not too confident, I'm still scared about turn 2 at most sport if I'm going to spin or something like that, or if you try to be very cautious when you drive, you're going to have a bad time, because the car is not going to care and it's going to bite you. So you got to have that mentality of, you know, I'm the greatest thing since sliced bread when I go drive, and people have to beat me. That doesn't mean that you're going to go out there and be a jerk on the track and not, you know, and drive people off the road. It means that you're fully confident in what you can do with the car and your skills at the time. So it's tough to do that. I mean, this is sports psychology, and if you don't, it's not going to happen overnight. But as you drive more and as you get more familiar and as you get more comfortable, you'll notice that, especially for your new guys, you'll notice that your attitude towards it starts to shift, and you'll start to go from, I don't really know what I'm doing, to, okay, yeah, I got a good idea of how this goes. I know what this car feels like too. Okay, I'm going to start attacking these corners. Go to a track that you've never ever been to before. You've never driven in sim. And take the car out. Even if you know the car, when you go out there, you're going to be like, well, I don't even know where the corners go. And every corner you come up to, you're going to be slightly terrified of, because you don't know where the brake point is. You don't know where the turn-in point is. You don't know anything. You don't know what the corner after it is. So you don't know where on track you need to be. But as you practice and as you start to learn the track, your confidence starts to increase, and it starts to go from, I just trying to survive and keep the car on the pavement, to, okay, I need to brake here and I need to turn in here, and I know I can get on the throttle earlier and I can go another 10th faster if I do this. And so your mentality is shifting from survival to attack. And that same kind of mental shift has to happen for when you go into those competitions for racing. You need to go from, I just don't want to die to, I'm going to perform well and I'm going to go out there with the goal of getting a top 10, right? And let's say you traditionally are finishing in the 15s, you know, in the top 20. So your goal is now top 10. That's my goal. That's where I want to be. And that's the confidence you need to have to say, that's what I'm fully capable of doing. And that's what I'm going to do. And if you start to do that, you'll be surprised at how powerful your mind is to be able to not convince you, but to have that mentality, to have that positive thinking will enable you to drive with confidence rather than with being like kind of meek and trying just to survive. So it's a huge thing, especially in sports, and anybody that's done competitive sports probably will say the same thing. But it goes back to that whole idea of, if you hate closed qualifying or hate open qualifying and think it's terrible and you can't set a good lap, you wish it was closed qualifying, you've already defeated yourself. It needs to be your favorite thing when you do it. And then once it's done, then you can debate all you want. And then when you go back to open qualifying the next week, it's got to be your favorite thing again. So keep that in mind. Try to work on that, and you'll be surprised at how faster you can go as a result. Anyway, that puts us at 7 o'clock. So the server, I'm guessing, should be open if it's not open already.
Yeah, Chris Braun from Zone 1 has the server just opened.
Perfect. So feel free to jump in. That's, again, Road Atlanta. Next week, same time, same place, 6 p.m. Central, Tuesday. I will do the track walk for Mosport and ahead of the Pro and Club races that week. So I hope to see you guys there for up in Canada for that next race. But always, in the meantime, feel free to reach out to any of us if you have any specific questions. We'll be happy to answer it. So thanks for coming. Thanks for watching.
Awesome.
Thank you, Chris.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. I'm